Welcome on
Emily
board. We are
Carter
so
had
happy
spent
to have you
years
with us today
mastering
on
the
this
art of
flight.
composure,
Please take your
the
time
kind
finding
that
your
made
seat and let us
strangers
know if
feel
we can
safe
assist
the
you with your
moment they
luggage
saw
as
her
you get settled in
smile,
for our
the
journey.
kind that allowed her to stand thousands of feet above the ground and still appear completely in control. On that morning, she adjusted her uniform with the same quiet precision, unaware that within hours, the life she believed she understood would shift in a way she could never undo. There are moments that divide a person's life into before and after, moments that arrive without warning and leave no space for preparation. For Emily, that moment began the second she looked up and saw a familiar face where it did not belong. Because walking toward her, relaxed, confident, and completely unaware, was Michael Carter, her husband of 6 years, a man she trusted, a man she defended, a man who was supposed to be somewhere else entirely. And beside him, holding his hand with a comfort that could not be mistaken, was another woman. In that instant, time did not rush forward. It slowed, stretching every second into something heavier, something that demanded to be understood. The world around her continued as normal, passengers boarding, voices blending into routine announcements. But for Emily, everything had already changed. There was no confusion, no denial, no need for explanation. Some truths arrived fully formed, undeniable in their clarity, and this was one of them. The man she loved had not just lied to her, he had stepped into a life that did not include her, and he had done so without hesitation. What followed was not an outburst, not a confrontation, not the kind of reaction most people expect when betrayal reveals itself so openly. Instead, Emily made a choice, one that would define everything that came after. And what she chose to do in that moment, standing at the entrance of that aircraft, would dismantle everything Michael believed he controlled without raising her voice once. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming. There are moments in life that feel too precise to be accidental, moments that seem arranged with an intention no one fully understands. And as Emily Carter stood there facing Michael Carter and the woman beside him, a quiet question settled deep in her mind, one that would not leave her no matter how composed she appeared on the surface. Was this a coincidence, or had something been unfolding long before this flight ever appeared on her schedule? Because betrayal like this rarely begins in a single moment, it builds quietly, in overlooked details, in small changes that are easy to excuse until they are no longer possible to ignore. And as Emily maintained her calm expression, greeting passengers as though nothing had shifted, another question pressed itself forward, heavier than the first. How long had this been happening right in front of her without her truly seeing it? The late nights, the sudden business trips, the subtle distance in Michael's voice when he spoke to her, all of it now demanded to be reconsidered, not as isolated incidents, but as pieces of a much larger truth that had been carefully hidden. Yet perhaps the most unsettling question of all was not about what Michael had done, but about what Emily chose not to do in that moment. Because she said nothing, not when she had every reason to speak, not when the truth stood directly in front of her. And that silence was not hesitation, it was something far more deliberate. It raised a final question, one that would define everything that followed. Who truly understood what was happening first, and who was actually in control of what came next? And as the aircraft doors prepared to close, and the reality of that encounter settled into something permanent, one final thought lingered, quiet but impossible to ignore. What would happen after the flight ended, when there were no uniforms, no passengers, and no reason left to remain silent? Long before that flight, before the silence, before the moment everything became undeniable, Emily Carter had built a life defined by consistency, care, and quiet strength. She was the kind of woman people trusted without needing a reason, someone who believed that love was something you showed through actions, not just words. Her work demanded long hours and constant travel, yet she carried her responsibilities with discipline, making sure that no matter how far she flew, home always felt like something steady, something worth returning to. To those around her, her marriage to Michael Carter appeared balanced, even admirable, the kind of relationship that seemed to function without effort. But the truth was more complex, because Emily noticed things others would overlook. She paid attention to tone, to timing, to the small shifts that often reveal more than grand gestures ever could. Emily wasn't the kind of woman who ignored red flags, She just believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. That belief kept her patient, kept her understanding, even when something felt slightly out of place. And for a long time, that patience allowed things to continue without confrontation. Michael Carter, on the other hand, had learned how to present exactly what people expected to see. He was successful, respected, and confident in a way that drew people toward him effortlessly. His work as a consultant placed him in environments where perception mattered, and he understood how to control that perception better than most. He knew how to listen when necessary, how to speak when it benefited him, and how to maintain an image that rarely invited suspicion. But beneath that polished exterior was a man who had grown comfortable living in two separate realities, one defined by stability and expectation, and the other by freedom and indulgence. Michael valued control, not just over his career, but over how people saw him, and that control extended into his marriage in ways Emily had not fully realized. Where she believed in connection, he relied on distance, carefully maintaining just enough presence to keep things intact while allowing himself space to move beyond it. Samantha Hayes entered that space not by accident, but by intention. She was not searching for rescue or validation. She understood exactly what she wanted and recognized opportunity when she saw it. Samantha was observant, confident, and drawn to a lifestyle that offered comfort, access, and excitement. Michael provided that, but more importantly, he represented a doorway into a world she had already decided she belonged in. Samantha didn't fall into this relationship. She walked into it with her eyes open. She understood the situation, the boundaries, and the risks, and she accepted them without hesitation because the rewards, at least in her view, were worth it. What began as something casual between them gradually became structured, intentional, and hidden behind a routine that allowed it to exist without immediate consequences. And while all of this unfolded, the signs began to surface in ways that were easy to explain away if someone wanted to believe everything was still intact. The late nights became more frequent, the explanations slightly shorter, the phone always just out of reach, turned face down more often than before. Conversations that once felt natural began to carry pauses, small gaps where something unspoken seemed to sit. Emotional distance is rarely sudden. It grows quietly, filling spaces that used to feel familiar. Emily noticed these changes, but she approached them with patience, trusting that whatever was shifting could still be understood, still be addressed. What she could not see, what she had no way of confirming, was the extent of what had already been set in motion behind those small changes. Because while she was trying to preserve what she believed still existed, something else had already taken shape beyond her awareness. And what Emily didn't know was how far it had already gone. As time moved forward, the distance between Michael Carter's two lives became easier for him to manage and far more dangerous for everyone involved. What had started as occasional meetings with Samantha Hayes quickly evolved into something structured around comfort, indulgence, and routine. Michael introduced her to spaces he rarely shared with anyone else: quiet restaurants tucked away from familiar faces, luxury hotels where anonymity came easily, and experiences designed to impress without leaving a trace. He learned what she liked, what made her smile, what kept her interested, and he provided it without hesitation. Expensive gifts appeared without occasion, weekends were planned with precision, and every detail reinforced the image he wanted her to believe. Samantha accepted it all with ease, not because she was unaware of what it meant, but because she understood exactly what role she had chosen to play. The arrangement worked, not because it was honest, but because it was convenient for both of them. The more he gave Samantha, the more he withdrew from Emily. What once required effort no longer felt necessary to him. At home, conversations became shorter, presence became inconsistent, and attention shifted elsewhere without explanation. He relied on familiarity to cover absence, assuming that what had always been steady would remain that way without needing to be maintained. The lies that once required careful thought became automatic, delivered with the same confidence he used in every other part of his life. Business trips extended without reason, meetings appeared suddenly, and explanations were offered just enough to avoid further questions. Emily listened, accepted, and adjusted, trusting that whatever was changing could still be understood within the boundaries of their marriage. But trust, once stretched, begins to change in ways that are difficult to measure until it reaches a point where it can no longer hold. It was during one of those carefully arranged moments, seated across from Samantha in a setting designed to feel distant from reality, that something shifted in a way Michael did not expect. Samantha watched him with a curiosity that had been building quietly, not out of insecurity, but out of awareness. She had observed the patterns, the consistency of his availability, the way he spoke about his time, and she understood that there was more beneath the surface than he openly acknowledged. She asked about Emily without hesitation, her tone light but deliberate, as though the question carried no weight at all. Michael did not pause. He dismissed it with ease, reducing his marriage to something distant, something that existed without interfering with what he had chosen to create elsewhere. In his mind, it was a simple response, one that maintained control and avoided complication. But what he failed to recognize was that the words he spoke in that moment were not contained within that space. They carried forward, shaping everything that would follow in ways he could not yet see, because that lie would follow him onto the plane. At the same time Michael Carter was carefully planning an escape disguised as opportunity, Emily Carter was stepping into something she had quietly worked toward for years without ever demanding recognition for it. Her dedication, consistency, and professionalism had not gone unnoticed, even if she never made a point of drawing attention to it. When the call came confirming her promotion to international routes, she didn't react with excitement at first, but with stillness, as if she needed a moment to fully understand what it meant. It wasn't just a change in schedule, it was a shift in her life, a sign that everything she had invested in her career was finally opening doors she once thought were out of reach. She thought of Michael almost immediately, imagining the way he would respond, the pride in his voice, the approval she had always valued even when she didn't say it out loud. For the first time in years, she wanted to surprise him, not with something extravagant, not with anything dramatic, but with something meaningful, something that reflected growth, progress, and the life they had built together. So she chose not to tell him right away. Instead, she carried the news quietly, allowing herself to enjoy the anticipation of sharing it at the right moment, when it would matter most. She packed her uniform with care, checked her schedule repeatedly, and prepared for the flight with the same calm discipline she brought to everything she did. There was a sense of pride beneath her composure, something steady and genuine, the kind that doesn't need to be announced to be real. At the same time, across the city, Michael was finalizing details of a completely different plan, one built on secrecy rather than achievement. He confirmed reservations, reviewed itineraries, and ensured that every part of his trip with Samantha Hayes aligned with the image he wanted to maintain. Luxury was not just a preference for him. It was a tool, a way to create experiences that felt separate from reality, untouched by responsibility or consequence. He moved through his preparations with confidence, believing that everything was under control, that every detail had been accounted for. Two lives moving forward in parallel, each carrying intentions that could not coexist, each built on assumptions that had yet to be challenged. Emily stepped into her role with purpose, ready for a new chapter she believed she would share with her husband. Michael stepped into his plan with certainty, convinced that what he was doing would remain hidden, contained within the boundaries he had created. Neither of them paused long enough to question how closely those paths were beginning to align, how decisions made independently were drawing them toward the same place at the same time. Because while one prepared to surprise and the other prepared to conceal, neither of them knew they were heading to the same place. The boarding line moved forward with quiet efficiency, a steady flow of passengers stepping out of routine and into something ordinary, something expected, but for Michael Carter, that sense of normalcy ended the moment his eyes fixed on the woman standing at the entrance of the aircraft. His steps slowed without intention, his confidence slipping in a way he could not control, as recognition settled in with a weight that left no room for denial. Emily Carter stood there in full uniform, composed, poised, welcoming each passenger with the same calm professionalism she had practiced for years. But when her eyes met his, even for a fraction of a second, something shifted that no one else in that moment could fully understand. Samantha Hayes felt the change before she understood it, sensing the tension in Michael's grip, the hesitation in his movement, the way his attention locked onto something ahead of them that suddenly mattered more than anything else. She followed his gaze, confusion rising as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. But before she could ask the question forming in her mind, the distance between them and Emily disappeared. In that single moment, everything became clear. There was no need for explanation, no need for confrontation, because the truth stood there in front of all three of them, undeniable and complete. Emily's expression did not break, her posture did not shift, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the same steady tone she used with every other passenger, but the meaning behind her words was anything but routine. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Mrs." The sentence landed without force, yet it carried a weight that settled into the silence that followed, a silence that stretched longer than it should have, longer than anyone behind them in line could understand. For a brief moment, everything slowed again, not in confusion, but in clarity, as if time itself had paused to acknowledge what had just happened. Michael did not respond immediately, his mind racing to catch up with a reality he had never prepared for, while Samantha stood beside him, the realization forming gradually, piece by piece, as she understood exactly who Emily was and what that meant for her place in this moment. Around them, passengers shifted slightly, unaware of the full story, but sensitive enough to notice the tension that lingered in the air. A glance here, a pause there, subtle reactions from people who could feel something had happened even if they did not know what. Samantha's grip on Michael tightened slightly, not out of comfort, but out of uncertainty, her composure beginning to crack as the situation revealed itself more clearly with each passing second. And through all of it, Emily remained exactly where she was, calm, controlled, unshaken in a way that felt almost deliberate. She stepped aside, allowing them to pass as though nothing had changed, as though this moment was just another part of her day, just another interaction to move through without disruption. But beneath that composure was something far more intentional, something that Michael could sense even if he did not fully understand it yet. Because Emily Carter had already made a decision, and whatever that decision was, it was not going to happen here, not in front of strangers, not in a place where emotions could take control. And that was what made it far more unsettling. But Emily didn't react the way anyone expected. The aircraft settled into its rhythm as the flight progressed, the quiet hum of the engines filling the space where conversation once might have been expected, and within that controlled environment, Emily Carter moved with the same calm precision she had always been known for. To anyone watching, she was simply doing her job, attentive, composed, and completely unshaken, but for Michael Carter, every step she took down that aisle carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. She approached their row without hesitation, her posture steady, her expression neutral, offering the same level of service she gave every other passenger. There was no sign of anger, no visible disappointment, nothing that suggested the moment at the boarding door had affected her in any way that others could see. Samantha Hayes sat quietly, her earlier confidence replaced by a growing awareness that this situation was far more complex than she had anticipated, her eyes following Emily with a mixture of uncertainty and unease. And through it all, Emily maintained control, not just of her actions, but of the entire situation, shaping it without needing to say anything at all. She wasn't avoiding confrontation, she was choosing the moment. When she reached Michael, she paused just long enough to acknowledge him as she would any passenger, her voice calm, professional, offering a selection of drinks with the same practiced tone. He responded quietly, his composure weakened by the realization that he was no longer in control of what was unfolding. Samantha attempted to mirror normalcy, placing an order as though the situation could still be managed, as though appearances could still be maintained. Emily prepared the drink with careful attention, every movement deliberate, every detail handled with the same quiet focus she had shown from the beginning of the flight. Then, as she leaned slightly closer to Michael, her voice shifted just enough to separate itself from the surrounding noise, low, controlled, meant only for him to hear. "I hope your business trip goes well." The words were simple, almost polite, but the meaning behind them landed with a force that required no explanation, cutting through every lie he had constructed with a clarity that left no room for denial. In that moment, The weight of everything he had done settled into something undeniable, something that could no longer be managed or dismissed. Emily straightened immediately, returning to her role without hesitation, moving forward as though nothing unusual had occurred, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any confrontation could have been. Samantha glanced at him, searching for reassurance, but found none, because Michael was no longer thinking about how to maintain control. He was realizing that he had already lost it. And that's when Michael realized she already knew everything. The cabin settled into a quiet routine, but for Michael Carter, there was nothing calm about the space he now occupied. Every second stretched longer than it should have, every passing moment giving his thoughts more room to move in directions he could not control. He stared ahead without really seeing anything, his mind replaying the brief exchange with Emily Carter over and over again, searching for something he might have misunderstood, something that could make the situation feel less final than it already did. But there was nothing unclear about it. Her tone, her timing, the precision of her words, all of it carried a certainty that unsettled him more than any confrontation ever could. Michael had always relied on his ability to manage situations, to explain, to adjust, to regain control when things shifted unexpectedly, but this was different. There was no conversation to steer, no reaction to respond to, no opportunity to correct what had been exposed. He was left alone with the realization that Emily was not reacting because she had already reached a conclusion. Beside him, Samantha Hayes sat in a silence of her own, one that was far from comfortable. The confidence she carried earlier had begun to fade, replaced by a growing awareness that she was no longer part of a controlled situation, but rather caught in something far more complicated. She watched Michael carefully, waiting for him to say something, to offer reassurance, to regain the composure she had come to expect from him, but he remained still, distant, consumed by thoughts he could not easily organize. Samantha shifted slightly, her unease becoming more visible with each passing minute, because even without understanding the full depth of what had just occurred, she could sense that something irreversible had already taken place. The tension between them was no longer about being discovered, it was about what that discovery meant moving forward, and neither of them had an answer for that. Silence can be louder than anger and far more dangerous. The absence of emotion from Emily did not create distance, it created pressure, the kind that builds without warning and releases without giving anyone time to prepare. Michael felt it in every quiet second, in every glance he avoided, in every thought he could not settle. He began to understand that this was not a moment he could recover from with explanation or apology, not because Emily had refused to react, but because she had chosen not to engage at all. And in that choice, she had taken something away from him that he had always depended on, the ability to influence what came next. By the time the aircraft doors opened and passengers began to step back into the world they had briefly left behind, Emily Carter had already separated herself from everything that moment represented. She moved through her remaining duties with the same steady professionalism, her voice calm, her actions precise, but internally something had shifted into clarity. There was no confusion left, no questions waiting to be answered, no uncertainty about what she had seen or what it meant. When her shift ended and she finally stepped into the quiet of her hotel room, away from the structure and routine that had carried her through the flight, she allowed herself a moment of stillness, not to process emotion, but to acknowledge a decision that had already taken shape. The room was silent, the kind of silence that leaves space for thoughts to settle without interruption, and in that silence, Emily did not search for explanations or revisit the past. She looked forward, calmly, deliberately, understanding that what she had witnessed was not a single moment of betrayal, but the confirmation of something that had been unfolding long before that flight. She didn't cry, she didn't argue, she decided. There was no hesitation in her movement when she reached for her phone, no second-guessing as she scrolled to a number she had saved but never imagined she would need. When the call connected, her voice carried the same composure she had maintained all day, steady, clear, and direct. She introduced herself, stated her request, and began a process that would formally end the life she had once believed in. There were no dramatic pauses, no emotional breaks, just a quiet certainty that left no room for reversal. The lawyer on the other end asked the necessary questions, and Emily answered them with the same clarity, each response reinforcing the decision she had already made before she even stepped off the plane. Outside, the city moved as it always did, unaware that within that room, a marriage had just reached its conclusion without confrontation, without negotiation, without a single raised voice. What made it more final, more absolute, was not the legal process itself, but the timing of it. Because while Michael Carter remained unaware, still moving through his version of events, still believing there was time to explain, to manage, to regain control, everything had already shifted beyond his reach. There would be no conversation waiting for him, no opportunity to correct what had been exposed, no moment where he could reshape the narrative in his favor. By the time he landed, it was already over. When Michael Carter returned, the city looked the same, the streets familiar, the routine unchanged. But the moment he stepped out of the elevator and faced the door to his home, something felt different in a way he could not immediately explain. There was no sound from inside, no movement, no indication that anyone had been there recently, and yet the stillness carried a weight that made him pause before reaching for the handle. The envelope attached to the door was the first sign that something had shifted beyond what he expected, his name written clearly across the front in a way that felt deliberate, final. He opened it slowly, not out of hesitation, but because some part of him already understood that whatever was inside would not be something he could dismiss. The documents were clear, formal, unmistakable in their meaning. Divorce papers, already filed, already in motion, already beyond discussion. For a moment, he remained where he stood, reading the words as though they might change if he looked at them long enough, but they did not. Inside the apartment, the silence confirmed what the papers had already made clear. The space no longer felt shared. No longer carried the small details that once reflected Emily Carter's presence. The absence was not chaotic or rushed. It was intentional, measured, as though every item removed had been part of a plan carried out with precision. The photographs were gone. The personal touches that once made the space feel lived in had disappeared, leaving behind something that felt unfamiliar despite its appearance. When he reached the kitchen, he saw the one thing that had been left behind, placed where it could not be missed. Emily's wedding ring rested on the counter, untouched, final in its meaning. Beside it was a note folded carefully, waiting for him to read it when everything else had already been understood. He opened it slowly, his attention fixed on the words written in a way that carried no anger, no emotion, just clarity. "You didn't lose me on that flight. You lost me long before you boarded it." There was nothing to respond to, nothing to argue against, nothing to reinterpret. The message did not invite explanation, because it did not need one. In that moment, Michael understood something he had avoided acknowledging for a long time, that what he believed he controlled had already been slipping away long before that day, long before that flight, long before he realized the consequences of his choices. And now, standing alone in a space that no longer belonged to the life he thought he had, he was left with the reality of what remained when everything else had already been taken away. In the weeks that followed, the reality Michael Carter had tried to avoid began to take shape in ways he could no longer ignore. The structure he once relied on, the routine, the control, the carefully maintained balance between two lives had disappeared, leaving behind something far less stable than he had imagined. Samantha Hayes, who had once moved through his world with confidence and ease, began to see things differently now that everything was no longer hidden. What had felt exciting in secrecy carried a different weight in the open, and the situation she had once accepted without hesitation no longer offered the same appeal. Conversations between them became shorter, less certain, filled with pauses that reflected a growing distance neither of them addressed directly. Eventually, without conflict or explanation, Samantha stepped away, choosing not to remain in something that had already lost its foundation. The connection that once seemed strong dissolved quietly, leaving Michael without the distraction he had relied on to avoid what was now unavoidable. At the same time, Emily Carter's life moved forward with a clarity that reflected the decision she had made without hesitation. Her career continued to grow, her presence within the airline gaining recognition in ways that extended beyond routine acknowledgement. The promotion that had once been a personal milestone became something larger, placing her in environments that reflected not just her professionalism, but her strength and independence. She carried herself with the same composure she had always shown, but there was something different now, something grounded in certainty rather than assumption. She was no longer navigating around uncertainty or waiting for things to make sense. She had already chosen her direction and moved forward without looking back. Her world did not revolve around what had ended, but around what had opened in its place, and that difference was visible in everything she did. He thought he was escaping, but he was the one being left behind. For Michael, the realization did not come all at once, but in quiet moments where there was nothing left to distract him from what had happened. The absence of Emily was not just physical, it was the absence of something he had taken for granted without fully understanding its value. What he had believed to be temporary choices had led to permanent outcomes, and there was no path back to what once existed. While he remained in the space he had tried to maintain, Emily had already moved beyond it, into a life that no longer included him. Some betrayals don't end in shouting, they end in silence and consequences that unfold long after the moment itself has passed. What makes a story like this linger isn't just what happened, but how it was handled, the choices made in a moment where emotion could have taken control, but didn't. Emily Carter didn't raise her voice, she didn't demand answers, she didn't create a scene that others would remember for the wrong reasons. Instead, she chose something far more deliberate, something that required clarity, strength, and a deep understanding of what she deserved. And in doing so, she changed the outcome entirely, not just for herself, but for everyone involved. It forces a question that stays with you even after the story ends, because there is no single right answer, only the one you would choose if placed in the same position. If you were in Emily's position, would you have confronted him or walked away like she did? And if this story surprised you, there's another one that's even more unbelievable coming next. Subscribe for more interesting stories and turn on your notification button.